Have you ever looked at your team and wondered, what happened to them? Why has morale dropped? Or why does nobody seem engaged anymore? You see, most leaders assume people just stop caring because they're unmotivated. In reality, people often stop caring because they've been caring too much for too long. So if they feel like they've given and given and given and it's not been noticed, they just get exhausted and start to question why? Why should I keep going? And oftentimes, disengagement is rarely the first problem. It's just the final symptom. And so when people all of a sudden who were very engaged and active and talking to leadership pull back, and you're like, they've stopped sharing ideas. I wonder what's going on. Burnout's already set in. That's a final symptom that they're probably contemplating leaving. Because the truth is, burned out teams don't stop caring because they're bad employees. They stop caring because their capacity has been depleted for too long. And this is where the cultural capacity equation becomes important. When capacity declines long enough, engagement eventually follows. And so as we walk through today's video, I want you to think about your own team and ask, are people contributing less? Has enthusiasm declined? Are employees doing the minimum instead of going above and beyond? And has collaboration become harder? And if you're noticing these patterns, I invite you to take the organizational burnout assessment that'll be linked below in the notes. It's a cultural diagnostic, an engagement predictor, and a workforce health assessment. It's a place to start. And later in the video, I'll explain how leaders can identify these warning signs before turnover starts setting in, before it takes hold. And if you haven't watched, I encourage you to go watch the first video in this series because I shared a little bit about my experience working at a psychiatric hospital. I'm going to expand on that today. So if you want to catch the first part, I encourage you to go watch that. But you see, at this hospital, when we slowed things down, looked at the root cause, looked at the structure, and we changed the structure to make sure that the patients were getting the treatment they were there for, staff started to show up. They felt supported because we were providing training and hands-on support on how do we implement these changes because it was new to everybody. The question of who's covering shifts stopped coming up because people were showing up for their shifts. We were able to start admitting new patients, and the work was still getting done. And so it wasn't a crisis situation after a crisis situation. It was, okay, we have a new flow, we have a new system. Let's work with that. Let's work together. But even then, things still had to change more because while the energy was starting to shift, it wasn't fully shifted. It was still different, right? Initiative had declined and people were less collaborative. So they implemented new structure. They understood what they had to do better. Crisis situations started to calm down. But now, how do we rebuild the people doing the job, right? We want that collaboration and that initiative because the complaints were still there. And leadership often assumed that it was a motivation problem. But the reality was people were already depleted, right? They were depleted for months before we changed the system. So we can change the system and see some excitement come back and some energy shift. But then we have to start focusing on the individuals doing the job and how do we help them recover from all that they had just been put through. Because once we understood that burnout was driving disengagement, we stopped focusing on motivation and started focusing on recovery and system. And that's a mistake many organizations make. They don't focus on the next step. They think one step implemented is enough to fix it. And so we have to pay attention to what burnout looks like when it first starts setting in, because we don't always notice it, right? The early signs look like people are just high performers, right? So high performers might be highly committed and highly responsible, meaning they show up for everything, right? They show up, they're the yes people. So they're just doing more work and they're at work all the time and they just look committed. But the truth is, they're probably quietly burning out. They're experiencing some hidden warning signs that they're not always going to speak about, because I've heard many times from employees that it's not safe to speak up. I'm not heard. And that's sad, because employees are the reason you can keep your doors open, right? They help you get the work done. They help serve your patients. They help you meet your mission. And so you might be asking, okay, so what are these early warning signs? Well, are employees becoming less enthusiastic? Are they showing more frustration, where they're just getting frustrated more often? Has creativity and problem solving declined? And maybe people are just more emotionally exhausted. We have to pay attention, because burnout often develops while performance still appears strong. Asking ourselves, are they really doing okay, or do they just appear to? And that's where I created the burnout to balance transformation model, right? Where we focus on what's truly causing burnout. We have to have that awareness before we can start to recover. And as we're recovering, we have to realign with our systems in order to create that balance, because most organizations don't notice employees until they're deep in burnout. And usually deep in burnout means they're resigning, they're quitting, they're calling out all the time, they're not speaking up. So we want to make sure that we're doing an employee emotionally check out, right? Check on them to make sure they're not emotionally checking out. Because if employees are emotionally checking out, chronic stress changes their behavior, meaning emotional exhaustion just increases. Hope often decreases. So if you have an employee who's usually hopeful, can see the silver lining, the positive in everything, and all of a sudden they're not talking that way anymore, they've probably lost their hope. And their initiative to start new projects or to help come up with new ideas or new ways of doing things that is more efficient stops, right? These are behaviors you're going to notice, because employees are going to start protecting themselves, meaning they're going to do the minimum to just get by. They're going to avoid extra responsibility because they're not invested anymore. And they've reduced their emotional investment, right? They just don't care. It doesn't matter. I hear that all the time. What I do doesn't matter. And that breaks my heart, because people should know that what they do matters. And we have to, as leaders, recognize this is not laziness. This is self-preservation. And it's self-preservation because when the nervous system prioritizes survival over engagement, it's about self-preservation. It's about the nervous system getting the person through whatever perceived or real crisis is going on, because that's how our stress response reacts. Our nervous system reacts to stress as if it's a traumatic event. It is a fight or flight response, which is survival over engagement. And we have to be careful, because sometimes as leaders, our behaviors can accelerate that disengagement. And I know this because I've been there. Are we making everything chronically urgent? So everything is a high priority. And we have to start to question and weigh what are the priorities and what can wait a week or two, because not everything can be a priority. That's how we unintentionally burn people out. Are we implementing constant change so employees don't feel like there's any stability, and they're questioning when are things going to slow down and stabilize around here? Too much change at one time causes employees to question, and they don't feel safe or stable. As a leader, are we forgetting to recognize the efforts of our employees? We don't want their effort to feel invisible, but if we're not recognizing it, that's what they feel. And that goes back to what I said earlier, where I hear comments like, it doesn't matter what I do. Nobody cares. As a leader, have we set unclear expectations? So if we have set unclear expectations, employees feel like they're set up to fail. And this happens all the time. Trial by fire, right? Or that's how you're onboarded. Just jump into the deep end. Okay. And how are we helping them thrive? Because dropping them into the deep end often means sink or swim. So survive or don't. So as leaders, we have to look at how clear are our expectations. We also have to recognize as leaders if you're burnt out or not, because if you're a leader who's burnt out, are you unintentionally or invisibly burning your team out? Right? Because one influences the other. And we have to pay attention to that. And so remember, the sustainable workforce method is about leadership and organizational strategy that directly influences team engagement. So this is about keeping everybody, regardless of the level of their position, healthy and productive, and keeping the system healthy to support that. Because healthy teams stay engaged. And when they're engaged, they experience clarity. They can think clearly and offer creative solutions. They support each other and hopefully feel supported from leadership. And I hear that one missing all the time. Healthy teams feel psychologically safe at work. And we have to. If we don't feel safe, we're not going to be productive. We also have to make sure that we are enforcing realistic workloads, not overworking people. And just because somebody takes something on short term doesn't mean we leave it there permanently. And as leaders, we have to stay consistent. Staff need to know what to expect from you. And if they don't know what to expect, they're not going to feel safe and it's not going to stay a healthy team. Right. And that's where in the previous video, I talked about the cultural capacity equation, where healthy cultures have high capacity, high engagement, and better performance. So if people are energetic, mentally clear, excited about their work, connected to the mission, they're going to be more engaged and they're going to perform better. And on the flip side, the burned out culture, people don't have the mental capacity or physical capacity to do the work, which means they pull back and they do the bare minimum. So they have lower engagement. And that in turn becomes lower performance. And so I think oftentimes leaders might put out engagement surveys, but I would have you look at that and say, are you missing the real problem? Because engagement surveys focus on satisfaction, morale, and engagement. But are you asking questions around mental and emotional capacity, around workloads and stress load? Are you asking about burnout risk? Because there are assessments specific to the healthcare field that can help assess that, right? Because burnout begins long before employees tell you they're struggling. You often find out they're struggling when they have decided to leave. So if your team seems less engaged, less collaborative, or they're less invested than they once were, don't assume they've stopped caring. I invite you to take the organizational burnout assessment that's linked below so you can identify your burnout risk for your organization. In this assessment, you'll discover those hidden stress patterns that are impacting employees, and you'll understand your workforce's vulnerabilities. This is the first step in my sustainable workforce method and helps leaders address root causes before they become turnover problems. Subscribe for the next video if this resonates with you, where we're going to talk about creating a burnout resistant team culture, where we will discuss why some teams stay resilient under pressure. We're going to talk about the leadership behaviors that create sustainable performance and how to build a culture that protects people before burnout occurs. Because most employees don't stop caring because they lost their work ethic. They stop caring because they've been carrying too much for too long. And burnout is not an engagement problem, it's a capacity problem. When leaders store capacity, engagement often follows. And so start with the organizational burnout assessment and identify where burnout may already be affecting your team.